Well, I don't think there's consensus even that there's such a thing as the science of wisdom. I think there are a lot of neuroscientists that you would talk to would say they don't study wisdom, they study an aspect of cognition or so on. I would say they're complementary. And one of the reasons I got into this and I thought was really interesting is I'm a science writer. I read scientific journals like Science and Nature all the time. And I was reading neuroscience articles or research reports, and I was seeing citations at the end of the articles of Socrates and John Stuart Mill and Spinoza, all these, obviously well-known philosophers who've had something to say about human wisdom or human cognition, basically how we decide things, how we think through problems, that sort of thing. I thought it was really interesting that people are doing brain studies and fMRI studies, brain scanning experiments, essentially, using these people as some of their kind of foundational sources of previous work in the general area. So I view it as much more complementary as opposed to one having an answer that the other doesn't.
Complementary.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's interesting. You began your book with a story on 9/11. And, one of the things you ended with was kind of the, not the uses, but, the effects, consequences of understanding our own mortality as it relates to wisdom. How do you see that, the kind of the yin and yang, or death and wisdom, if you will, as, helping to, better understand ourselves, or, do you see people, getting kind of close to death, testing their own mortality in order to better understand their wisdom?
I wouldn't say people test their mortality. I guess so. Some people probably do.
Right.
I guess I would characterize it as there's probably a focus that comes with an increased sense of one's mortality. For a lot of people, that probably comes toward a later stage in life, because obviously when you're in your 60s, 70s, 80s, friends are dying, family members are dying, that sort of thing. The presence of mortality is almost inescapable. And for some people, I think it happens actually earlier, if they've either been exposed to illness or death in the family, or they themselves may have experienced it. But I think the intense focus that kind of experience engenders, in the book I talk about this favorite Robert Nozick quote when they ask what is wisdom, and he boiling down the whole thing, and he says wisdom is knowing what is important. And then the next question is, what factors contribute to knowing what's important? How do you know? I think mortality probably, and an impending sense of mortality, or an urgent sense of mortality, probably is one of those factors that gets people to focus a little bit more intently on what's really important. And I should say, and this idea of what's important, I don't think the same thing is important I think it changes in different phases of life. I think what's important maybe when you're younger is not so important when you're older, and vice versa. So what's important is actually a pretty relativistic and contextual kind of thing. It's kind of what's going on in your life right then.
Right. Let me see here. Well, I guess, it's interesting regarding the value of wisdom. We see the commodification of wisdom everywhere. It's just ubiquitous, and it becomes reduced to a soundbite to a certain degree. And that you spoke a little bit about the fuzziness of the concept of wisdom, and how that kind of was a difficulty in the scientific and empirical circles to be able to capture, the meaning of it. Certainly, you spoke to the contextual and situational aspect of wisdom. Do you think that, from your research and in speaking with a lot of these neuroscientists, do you think that, that fuzziness undermines the value of wisdom as a serious subject matter in scientific circles, or is that something that is, or undermines its value in terms of how just everyday people see it as an ideal? rather than happiness or.
Maybe it'd be helpful if I just talked very quickly about how I got into this, because
Yeah,
I think it actually.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
So this started out when I got a call from editor at the New York Times Magazine. They're doing a special issue on aging, and they wanted to know if I would be interested in doing a story for the special issue, and I do a lot of stuff for them, and I said sure. And then they said, we want you to do, we've heard there's a research on wisdom, and we thought that'd make an interesting story. And my initial reaction was, it has to be bogus. I mean, wisdom is not something you could scientifically study. But I agreed to look into it a little bit. And what I discovered was there was a school of psychology basically in the 1970s and 80s, based both in the United States and in Europe, that was sort of psychologically studying what the constituent parts of wisdom were. Primarily, it actually grew out of a study of aging people and sort of what their values were and how they viewed life and sort of this sort of thing. And the long and the short of it is that they began to, do sort of a systematic psychology of wisdom. What are the psychological qualities that contribute to wisdom? And there's certain things like patience and compassion, this ability to deal with uncertainty. And again, I found it fascinating. At first I thought it was a completely fruitless, precisely because it's so fuzzy. How could you possibly study this? Nonetheless, it was really intriguing because the issues that it brings up are things that we all, should think about a lot and probably don't think as much about as we might, just given the busyness of our modern lives. But I found it really fascinating. And then I realized that although nobody in neuroscience thinks of wisdom as a seemingly legitimate topic because it is so big and so fuzzy and ill-defined, and the first thing you do in a science is you have to define the problem before you can study it. And wisdom is a very difficult problem to define. But I realized that little pieces of it were being investigated by a lot of people. They weren't looking at wisdom, but some people were looking at patience. People were looking at compassion. People were looking at decision making, what goes into a good decision, or how do you make a decision, moral judgment, all these things that have been traditionally and historically associated with wisdom. Little bits and pieces of it were being investigated very specifically within the scientific community. No one was talking about wisdom. What was interesting is I turned in the manuscript for this book, I think it was like in 2009. And like 2 months after I turned it in, there was actually a research review article saying the neuroscience of wisdom, the neurobiology of wisdom. So someone had begun to actually look at it and kind of this encompassing overall view. So to get back to your original question, I think one of the things that's really interesting but also very challenging about wisdom, unlike intelligence, which we think we can test for, although I'm not convinced that the parameters of that testing is particularly successful or has really kind of put its finger on what intelligence is. But at least we have the presumption that we can prepare a set of questions for an intelligence test, and you either answer them and you get them right or you're wrong, and that tells us how intelligent you are. And one of the points that somebody's made in wisdom is that you can't test for wisdom because there are no right answers. The answer will change depending not only on the question, but the timing of the question and what's going on around the question. So from a scientific point of view, that's obviously very difficult to get your arms around. On the other hand, what makes us successful species is our adaptability, which is understanding that the situation is not exactly the way it was before and how we have to change in order to take advantage of it from a survival point of view, or being able to adapt to changing circumstances or uncertainty and still move forward. And I think the human brain's capacity to do that, I think, is unrivaled in the animal kingdom. So it's a very worthy, we're at the beginning of the beginning of the beginning of studying this, but it's a really worthy thing to be thinking about how the brain adapts to uncertainty, how it adjusts to changing circumstances. And in fact, there's been a lot of really fascinating research in the last 10 or 15 years about how the brain reacts when something unpredictable happens. Because it kind of freaks out, but it really pays attention at the same time. It's a focusing device in the same sense that maybe mortality is a focusing device.
Right, right. No, that's fascinating. Did you do, just a little off the cuff, did you have a lot of research that you couldn't fit into the book that you thought was really interesting? Or?
Well, there's a lot, there's so much stuff going, and it keeps going on. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff that's happened since then. Right. One of the things that was really fascinating to me was kind of a social intelligence, how people act in groups and sort of to be cooperative or uncooperative, altruism being a component of that. Mm-hmm. I think that's a hugely important element in any kind of communal survival organization, people living together, mm-hmm. Optimizing their environment, optimizing their potential within that environment. And so social cooperation is a really huge part of it. And there's a huge amount of research that's been going on about that. And much more to come, but it's really interesting.
Interesting. Fascinating. Let me just research here. Well, this is you kind of ended the book a little bit, and you may have said this in an interview that kind of a test for wisdom can't be reduced necessarily to an algorithm, but you have a little test that says in any situation, will this make me wiser? Or, mm-hmm. Have you found yourself using that test, or do you is it something that we are we should be conscious of, or is it something that just kind of fades into
our unconscious? I think like anything, you have to work at it a little bit. Right. But how do you work at wisdom? Well, I don't think you can systematically work at it. I do, and I wrote about this in the book. I mean, there were these moments where, and I think when you're in a family or any kind of social situation, things come up all the time. And negotiating the society of life, I think, is one of the real tests of wisdom all the time, on a daily, if not hourly basis. And it's challenging, and I found myself stopping myself long enough to say, what would be the wise thing to do here? Because we often have, sort of impulsive reactions to things. I certainly do, and I suspect many other people do. And it's kind of overriding the impulse. Not always, because sometimes impulse is actually good. So again, it's the context of when impulse is good as opposed to when impulse is not going to serve you. But right. I find that pausing, because for the most part we don't pause, mm-hmm. pausing to just say, what would be the best thing to do here? What would be the wisest thing to do here? And kind of challenging myself in that sense. Mm-hmm. And it's just that, routine domestic things that come up. Children have, vying desires or competing wants or irreconcilable desires. And, every day presents these challenges. I mean, I think wisdom plays out a lot. It's not just a Socratic, dialogue sitting around a table. It's right. maybe sitting around the dinner table and resolving these kinds of conflicts that come up all the time, or trying to figure out what seems to be the best way to do it. But I think the pausing part of it is the thing that I really felt was kind of left out of a lot of our modern life, because we don't pause. Right. We don't take the time to pause, and the pause stops us long enough to think and step back a little bit.
Absolutely. Regarding, I was fascinated with the 8 pillars, the 8 neural pillars of wisdom, and you talk about, reductionism, from a scientific principle, looking at the big picture and then breaking it down into component parts. Do you think, a lot of the component parts that you talked about, moral reasoning and aging and uncertainty, certainly are aspects of wisdom. There's probably myriad of different parts to that. Do you think, wisdom lends itself to a reductionism, or is it something that is, again, so illusory or so ill-defined that it sort of it dissolves.
I wouldn't say it dissolves, but I would say it does not lend itself to reductive. As a science writer and someone who's written about neuroscience over the years, one of the sins that we've committed as journalists, and I think the world has kind of avidly followed in our footsteps, is to point at a part of the brain and say this is the part of the brain that's the center of fear, or this is where your moral reasoning comes from. I think what's emerging is that it's actually this combination of different elements coming together. It's a network, and it's the strength of the network that's been shaped by experience and probably genetics and all sorts of stuff. Now, I don't think that makes wisdom too reductive, because what's getting fed into that, the experience, is not reductive. It's what we all encounter. So we're kind of, that's the learning that we do, the life learning that we do, that's actually creating a reality in our brains that reminds us that in the prior time I encountered this situation, I did this, and it ended up with this result, and maybe that's would be this right action now, but maybe it's slightly different, and so it forces you to be very astute, I think, in terms of critical thinking and seeing, is this situation actually the same as the one that it seemed to be previously, or is it different, and does that difference therefore shift it a little bit in terms of what the decision-making process should be? That's not reductive. I mean, it obviously depends on a cognitive kind of formula for how you respond to the world, but at the same time, it's very cumulative, it's very additive, it's very adaptive, and all those things are not purely reductive. In fact, they really build on themselves. So it's using the mechanism to kind of be more adaptive.
Okay.
I mean, that's sort of my take on it at this point.
Interesting. I think that is that's it. I also just read your article on aging.
In
National Geographic.
Yeah.
Really, really got a lot out of that. It was very interesting, just especially the lost Jewish tribe. And
I know that was
I was like, okay,
the gene that traveled across the ocean.
The gene that, I noticed. I mean, in the article, you didn't inject any kind of really that I remember, philosophical or speculative notions about the connection between aging and wisdom, or
right.
Did you have any insight from your research there? I mean, like people that. I don't know what surveys are being done or research that's being done, to connect, what qualities of, wisdom or qualities of aging lend itself to wisdom.
There are 2 points I'd like to make, because they're really interesting and they're a little counterintuitive. Okay? One of the things I did find out when I was researching the book, there were some studies. There was this group based in Berlin, led by the psychologist named Paul Baltus, who's quite well known, and did really interesting work. One of the questions they asked is, what are the roots of wisdom? Where does wisdom start? And we kind of culturally assume that's associated with age. But one of the things they found was that the roots of wisdom were probably much earlier in life, possibly as early as adolescence. So even though we think of the elderly person as being wiser, we assume old and wiser, or old but wiser. There's probably a lot that goes into wisdom that begins much earlier in life. It's kind of the cultivation of values and experience and how you process all that stuff. So it's not necessarily an old person's game. I guess that's one thing I'm going to say. The other thing is that, and this kind of gets back to this reductive point, but it was also very true of the aging article. I very much believe that things are complex and not simple. And one of the things about aging is that it's very complex. There's not a gene that will help you live longer. There are going to be dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of genes that interact in certain ways. And again, one combination is going to shift things a little bit this way, but other things will happen. And luck is a part of this formula. Environment, parents, where you live, poverty, socioeconomic status, the foods you ate because of those things. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this, just as there is to wisdom. And there's not going to be a wisdom part of the brain, and there's not going to be a gene for wisdom.
I was going to say, they're not going to identify the wisdom gene.
No, there's not a wisdom gene. There's not an aging gene. There's not a immortality gene. I very much think it's important for the public to understand that we're complex organisms, and things don't. There are a few examples of if you're missing one gene, you're in big trouble, right? That'll cause Huntington's disease or something like that. But for something like intelligence, for something like wisdom, for something like heart disease or cancer, all these things, it's a huge, complex mechanism and machinery that's feeding into this. And so I just try to encourage people to think much more broadly and a little bit deeper in terms of what's going on here, because it's not simple. It's not going to be easily explained, and there's not going to be one thing. And again, journalists have contributed to this, because we all say the gene for obesity, the gene for this, the gene for that. And I think if we've learned anything in the last 10 years, it's that there's not usually a single gene for this or that. It's much more complex.